Lydia Hart could feel 50 pairs of eyes fixed on him through the frost-fogged glass. They hadn't moved in over an hour. Warriors in wolf-skin mantles and painted faces stood along his fence line, the winter sun catching streaks of red and black across their cheeks. Not a whisper, not a tilt of the head, just stillness. The kind of stillness that tightens a man's chest. He raised his coffee cup, but his hand shook enough to ripple the dark surface. From where he sat, the line of Comanche braves looked less like men than like a wall, one that could move forward at any second. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the young rancher counted what he had to defend himself. A single rifle over the hearth, a revolver with 3 rounds left, and 2 good horses. Against 50 mounted warriors, it was nothing. Outside, the air was bright and brittle. Inside, the air was heavy, heavy with questions Elijah couldn't answer. Why had they come? Why now? Why him? His gaze drifted to the far corner of the room, to the chair where his coat should have been hanging. It wasn't there. The space was bare. Memory struck like lightning. It had been last night. The storm had rolled in without warning, slamming the prairie with sheets of cold rain. He was checking the corral when he saw her, a lone figure pushing through the downpour. Each step deliberate, stubborn, like she was forcing herself to keep moving when her body wanted to give out. Her dress clung to her legs, her long black hair plastered to her shoulders, rainwater streaming down her face. She kept glancing over her shoulder toward the tree line, quick, sharp glances that spoke of more than just weather. "Ma'am, you need shelter," he'd called, sloshing through mud toward her. When she turned, lightning lit her face. Her eyes, dark, searching, were wide, not with fear of him, but of something else entirely. "I cannot stay," she said, her voice barely cutting through the thunder. "My people will worry." Elijah didn't think, he acted. His mother had taught him that. Even after she'd passed, her voice had stayed with him. "Do not withhold kindness from a stranger. You may be entertaining angels without knowing it." He hadn't known that was scripture back then, but later someone told him, Hebrews 13, verse 2. So he'd stripped off his thick wool coat, the one his father had worn through the worst winters, and settled it over her shoulders. She'd looked down at it as though he'd given her something precious beyond measure. When her gaze lifted back to his, the intensity in it had made his throat tighten. "You would give this to me?" she asked. "Just until the storm passes," he replied, cheeks heating. "You're freezing." She pulled it tighter, and for a moment they simply stood there, rain soaking through his shirt, the world reduced to the hiss of water and the strange connection between them. Then she smiled, not a polite curl of the lips, but something deeper, as if she saw through to the part of him even he rarely visited. "My name is Naya," she'd said. "Lydia Hart. I will remember this kindness, Lydia Hart." And then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness before he could offer her a place by the fire. Now, in the pale light of morning, with a line of silent warriors cutting his property from the open prairie, Elijah understood 2 things. Naya hadn't gone home, and his coat, his father's coat, was still with her. Somewhere between last night's storm and this morning's sun, the simple kindness he'd offered had turned into something dangerous. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the frost on the window. The warriors didn't flinch. He set down the coffee. The cup's rim clicked against the table, louder than he meant. In the distance, a figure began walking toward his porch, the line of warriors parting to let him pass. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hair bound with rawhide, his steps unhurried. Elijah couldn't yet make out the man's face, but he could feel the weight of the moment bearing down. He didn't know it then, but that small act beneath a storm-lashed sky had already bound his name to a story far greater than his own, one that would test not only his courage, but the measure of his soul. The man in the wolf fur mantle moved like he owned the ground beneath his feet. Each step was measured, deliberate. The warriors on either side straightened as he passed, their painted faces turning toward him with quiet respect. When he reached the edge of Elijah's porch, he stopped. The wind caught the mantle's edge, revealing a breastplate of finely tooled leather. His gaze, dark, steady, and unreadable, met Elijah's through the glass. Elijah pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in the cold. The man spoke first, his voice low but carrying. "We speak of the girl in your coat." There was no question in the words, only fact. Elijah's stomach tightened. "Naya?" The man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing his answer. "She left our camp 2 days ago to gather herbs for her grandmother. She was due back before the storm." A pause. "She did not return." Elijah hesitated, unsure how much to say. "I saw her last night. She was alone. Injured, maybe. She was favoring one leg. I offered her shelter. She refused, said her people would worry." The man stepped closer to the porch rail. "You gave her your coat." It wasn't an accusation, not exactly, but it felt like one. "It was cold," Elijah replied. "I was just—" "Kind," the man finished, though his tone was unreadable. He straightened to his full height. "I am Tahan, chief of this band. Naya is my daughter." The title landed like a hammer blow. Chief, daughter, missing. Elijah's mind turned over the implications. If she was the daughter of a chief, the presence of 50 armed warriors on his fence line suddenly made more sense, and far less comfort. Tahan's gaze never wavered. "Someone took her. They will not expect me to ride with a white rancher. That will unsettle their plans. And you," he studied Elijah for a beat, "you will see things I might miss." "I don't understand." "There are men in my band I have known since boyhood," Tahan said. "Men who have shared my fire. But even among them there may be one who would trade my daughter's safety for his own gain. I cannot accuse without proof. You will watch their faces." The weight of what he was asking settled on Elijah's shoulders like wet wool. "Why me?" "Because you were the last to see her," Tahan said simply. "And because the moment you gave her your coat, you became part of this." Elijah glanced past the chief toward the waiting warriors. He imagined riding out with them into country he barely knew, alongside men who might see him as an enemy, with the shadow of suspicion already over his head. Every instinct told him to refuse. This wasn't his fight. It wasn't his people. And yet, he could almost hear his mother's voice again, words she'd spoken over 1,000 small chores and hard decisions. "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters." Colossians 3, verse 23. He looked back at Tahan. "All right, I'll go." The chief's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of approval, perhaps, or respect held in reserve. "We leave at once," Tahan said. As they turned toward the waiting horses, Elijah's gaze swept the warriors. One young man at the far left, tall, lean, with a hawk feather braided into his hair, looked away quickly when Elijah met his eyes. Another, older and broad-shouldered, tapped his fingers against the pommel of his saddle in a slow, steady rhythm. A third, with a jagged scar across his jaw, watched Elijah too closely, as if memorizing him. He didn't know their names yet, but they would come, and he would remember the way each one looked in this moment.
By the next sunset, Lydia Hart would ride into a wilderness where trust was rarer than water, and every mile would weigh his soul.
If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. They left the ranch at first light, a column of riders cutting across the frost-tipped grass. Elijah kept his horse close to Tahan's, more from necessity than choice. Every direction beyond his fence line was a country he barely knew. The storm had scoured the land clean, but not clean enough to fool the chief. Within the first mile, Tahan lifted a hand, bringing the column to a halt. He dismounted, crouching low over a patch of churned mud. "Here," he said, pointing with 2 fingers. "Her left step sinks deeper than the right." She twisted her ankle. Elijah slid down from his saddle. At first, all he saw was mud. Then he noticed it. The slight inward angle of the left print. The deeper sink where her weight had shifted. Beside it, a second set of prints, larger, heavier, following close behind. "Not walking together?" Elijah asked. "No," Tahan said. "This man forced her to move faster than she wished. See how her prints lengthen? She was almost running." Elijah felt his chest tighten. The ground ahead bore more of the same, her hurried stride, his long, even steps, until a third detail emerged. "These are fresh," Tahan murmured, touching the edge of one print. "Within a day." The realization settled like a stone in Elijah's stomach. They were close. Close enough that if he raised his voice, perhaps she might hear, if she was free to answer. They mounted again, moving at a steady pace. Elijah scanned the faces around him. Some rode with eyes fixed ahead, unreadable. Others glanced toward the trees, the open ridges, measuring, calculating. And then there were the few who met his gaze for a heartbeat too long, as if weighing what kind of man he was and how he might fit into whatever game they were playing. The land began to rise, small ridges casting long shadows across the prairie. Tahan slowed as they approached a narrow stretch where cottonwoods crowded the path. "This trail is known to my people," he said, "too well known. If there is a trap ahead, it will be here." Elijah frowned. "You think they're waiting for us?" "I think," Tahan said, scanning the tree line, "that they knew I would take this route. That means they know me, or they know someone who does." A cold ripple moved through Elijah's thoughts. If the captor knew Tahan's habits, then someone had told him. Someone who had been close enough to learn them. As they cleared the trees, Elijah glanced back. A pair of riders toward the rear were speaking in low tones, one tilting his head toward Tahan before looking away quickly. Elijah didn't catch the words, but he caught the feeling, an undercurrent that didn't belong to open rescue. The trail opened again, the sky stretching wide overhead. They rode on, the hoofbeats steady, but the air between them heavy with unspoken suspicion. Elijah kept replaying the prints in his mind, the uneven stride, the trampled mud, the silent conversation happening all around him. Somewhere in this column was the truth. Somewhere in this column there was a man who had helped take Naya. And if that was true, then finding her would mean more than following the right trail. It would mean knowing who, among the men riding beside him, was already leading them into a trap. By midday, the wind carried the low roar of water. The Canadian River lay ahead, swollen from the storm, its surface a restless sheet of brown and silver. The crossing was narrow but treacherous, mud sucked at the hooves, and driftwood spun past in the current. Tahan raised his hand again. "Hold," he ordered, his gaze fixed on a low-hanging branch near the bank. Elijah followed his eyes, and his heart lurched. There, snagged deliberately on the branch, was his wool coat, the one he had draped over Naya's shoulders in the storm. It hadn't been torn free by accident. The sleeves were knotted tight around the branch, tied in a way no wind could have managed. "She left it for us to find," Elijah said quietly. Tahan was already dismounting. He reached into the coat's deep pocket and pulled out something small, a strip of river birch bark.
Charcoal lines marked its surface, sharp and deliberate. The chief studied it for a long moment before speaking. It says, "The daughter pays for the father's crimes. Sunset tomorrow, or she dies." A murmur ran through the riders. Elijah felt it too, not just the shock of the threat, but the weight of the time it offered. More than a day. Too much time for a simple execution. "That's not just a deadline," Elijah said. "It's an invitation. They want you to do something before then." Tahan's jaw tightened. "They want me humiliated before my people." He turned the bark over in his hands, as if the message itself were a thorn.
"The man who took her is Kita," Tahan said at last. "He was once of our blood, until he broke the laws of the band. Last winter, he accused me of stealing horses from his family. He challenged me to fight. I defeated him, but spared his life." "Seems like mercy wasn't the reward he wanted," Elijah said. "No. Now he wants my place. He thinks holding Naya will force me to abdicate and name him chief." Elijah thought about the tied coat, the clear handwriting, the pointed message. And the 24 hours? Tahan looked at him steadily. "He wants time for the story to spread. Time for my authority to rot while my daughter is in his hands." The river swelled between them and the far bank. Tahan's scouts searched for a safe crossing, while the rest kept their eyes on the tree line. Elijah stayed close to the coat, turning the bark over in his mind as much as in his hands. The audience, if they were here, would see it too. A trap built as much from pride as from rope. The captor wasn't just after the girl. He was after the man who would move heaven and earth to save her. One of the older warriors muttered something to his companion, glancing toward Tahan with a look Elijah didn't like.
He couldn't catch the words, but the tone was enough. In this kind of game, you didn't need every man to betray you, just the right one at the right time. By the time they found a ford, the sun had shifted, shadows drawing long fingers across the grass. Tahan tucked the coat into his saddlebag and kept the bark in his hand. "Sunset tomorrow," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Before then, we find her, or we prepare for war." Elijah urged his horse into the river. The cold water climbed up to the stirrups, and the current fought him every step. But his mind wasn't on the crossing. It was on the fact that they were now racing not just against distance, but against the clock, and every man in this column knew it, including the one who was hoping they'd fail. They crossed the Canadian just before mid-afternoon, hooves sucking free of the mud with each step onto the far bank. The river's roar faded behind them, replaced by the low whisper of wind through tall grass. The trail led on for another half-mile before the ground changed. Flatter here, the grass thinner, the soil dry enough to hold tracks. And that was where the problem began.
3 sets of tracks, each diverging in a different direction. One cut northwest, toward the pale rise of the Caprock Escarpment. Another wound back south, toward Elijah's ranch. The last curved east, hugging the river as it meandered toward the horizon. The horses blew steam into the cooling air, while Tahan dismounted to study the sign. His eyes moved from one set of prints to the next, lips pressed thin. Kitts edged his mount forward. "Chief," he said, loud enough for the whole party to hear, "we should divide. Send riders down each trail. We can't afford to lose time choosing the wrong one." On the surface, it made perfect sense. Elijah even felt the instinctive tug of agreement, until he saw the way Kitts's gaze lingered just a moment too long on the canyon path to the northwest. Tahan straightened slowly. "No," he said. Kitts frowned. "No? Chief, we have until tomorrow's sunset. If we pick wrong, then we ride together and find the truth, not scattered like cattle in a lightning storm," Tahan cut in. His tone had sharpened, enough to still the murmurs rising among the men. These trails are not chance. They were laid to draw us thin.
If we split, we give them exactly what they want. A few warriors shifted in their saddles. Elijah caught Ravo's jaw tighten, the muscle ticking once before it went still. Chano's gaze dropped to the ground for a long beat, his lips pressed tight as if against words he didn't want heard. The tension in the air was almost visible. Elijah kept his own voice low, leaning toward Tahan. "That canyon to the northwest, why does it matter?" "Because it's where you'd set an ambush," Tahan murmured without looking at him. "Narrow walls, high ground, one way in, one way out. A war party could die there before it even saw the enemy." Kitts cleared his throat, still trying. "Chief, if you fear an ambush, then surely it is better to send only a few down that path, not the whole company." "No, Kitts," Tahan said, his eyes finally lifting to meet the young man's. There was no anger in the chief's voice now, just the iron certainty of a man who had decided on his course. "If they want us to fear the canyon, we will walk through it together, side by side." A slow exhale rippled through the group. Some of the men looked relieved, others, not so much.
Elijah saw the flicker of irritation on Kit's face before it smoothed into something more neutral. For the audience, it was a moment worth savoring because the trap had just been half sprung and then snapped shut on empty air. Tahan remounted, signaling with 2 fingers toward the river trail. "We ride east. The prints there are heavier. Someone was moving faster than their wound should allow. That is where the truth lies." The company wheeled as one. Grass hissed under hooves. The sun was already leaning toward the west, its light sliding lower across the plains. Elijah felt the weight of every minute. They might have avoided the first snare, but the game was still Ketta's, and every mile brought them closer to where he wanted them. By late afternoon, the prairie began to change. The easy grassland broke into uneven ground where the wind had bitten deep into the soil, leaving it scarred with gullies and patches of bare clay. The horses felt it first, hooves slipping in loose gravel, ears twitching at the hollow clink of stone underfoot. Tahan called for a slower pace. "This ground will eat your horse's strength if you push," he said.
"We ride steady or we ride lame." They wove between clumps of mesquite, the branches snagging at their sleeves. When they found a narrow creek, the chief signaled for a halt. Men swung down from their saddles to water the horses and refill their canteens. From a canvas pouch, Chano measured out coarse ground cornmeal, mixing it into a thick paste with creek water before wrapping it in a strip of damp cloth and tucking it near the saddle horn to warm in the sun. Elijah watched, noting the quiet efficiency. Out here, food wasn't cooked for taste. It was prepared to survive the ride. "You're staring, White Rancher," one of the older warriors said with a dry smile. "Just learning," Elijah replied. "Back home, I thought I knew hard work. This—" He let the thought trail off, shaking his head. The warrior chuckled, then poured a little of his own water onto a rag to wipe down his horse's legs. "You learn fast, or you don't last." They mounted again, the trail now hugging a low ridge. To the right, the land dipped toward a shallow basin where old buffalo bones lay half buried in the dust. The wind carried the faint smell of sage. As they rode, 2 men at the rear began talking softly about Naya, not in the tone of gossip, but of memory. Elijah caught fragments. "Taught her to shoot before she could ride proper. Only girl to hit the antelope clean at full gallop. Tahan, riding just ahead, didn't turn, but his shoulders lifted slightly, as if he'd heard every word." Elijah let the words settle. He pictured her in the rain that night, hair plastered to her face, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. The image now had weight. She wasn't some helpless wanderer. If she was in trouble, it wasn't for lack of skill.
The ridge narrowed into a rock shelf no wider than 3 horses abreast. The drop to their right was a sheer 15 feet to broken stone. Men leaned back in their saddles, giving the horses their heads. Hooves scraped, sending pebbles skipping into the void. Halfway across, Elijah's gelding stumbled, throwing him forward against the horn. He heard Ravo laugh under his breath, not loud, but enough to notice. Elijah didn't answer. He just patted the gelding's neck until the animal found steady footing again. When the trail widened, they paused to let the rear catch up. The sun was dropping lower now, burnishing the rocks with gold. Somewhere to the east, a hawk cried, a thin, distant sound that seemed to fall into the silence between hoofbeats. Tahan glanced at the sky. "We camp when the ridge ends. No fire tonight. We ride at first light." The men nodded. No fire meant no scent of smoke for the wind to carry. No fire meant they believed they were close enough to be smelled. Elijah sat straighter in the saddle, scanning the land ahead. The prairie, the stones, the shadows, all felt like they were holding their breath. And for the sharp-eyed among them, one truth was already clear. Every mile forward was narrowing the space between hunter and hunted. The wind shifted just after midday, bringing with it a faint, acrid scent of wood smoke. Tahan raised a hand, halting the column. The warriors spread in a loose semicircle, scanning the horizon. It was Elijah who spotted the thin thread of smoke far to the south, barely visible against the pale sky. "Campfire?" he asked. Tahan's gaze lingered on it. "Too far for us to reach before dark." And if they wanted to hide, they would have. The older men exchanged quiet words in Comanche, their faces unreadable. Then one of the scouts rode in from the north, his horse flecked with foam. "Bluecoats," the man said in English, out of respect for Elijah's ears. 2 days passed, a patrol of 10, asking questions about a young woman, black hair, buckskin dress. Murmurs rippled through the group. The word bluecoats was heavy here. Tahan's face didn't change, but his voice was iron. "Which direction?" They turned west toward the military road. The chief considered this a moment too long, and Elijah could almost hear the unspoken thought. Someone wanted them to believe the cavalry had her. A younger warrior broke the silence. "If the soldiers took Naya, then we should—" "They did not take her," Tahan cut in, calm but final. "They are bait in another man's snare." Elijah saw Ravo's jaw flex, quick, sharp, at the mention of soldiers. Across from him, Chano kept his eyes low, studying the dirt as if it held answers. No one spoke of Keta, but Elijah filed the reactions away. He was starting to read the small tells now, the things the chief had asked him to notice. As they moved on, the terrain opened into a flat stretch of buffalo grass. The wind roared across it, carrying voices farther than they should have gone. 2 riders ahead spoke just loud enough for Elijah to catch snatches. "If the chief chases ghosts, the girl's already lost. And if the ghost wears a blue coat, we'll never see her again." Elijah knew they wanted those words to reach him. Seeds of doubt sown in open ground. That night they camped in the lee of a sandstone bluff. No fire, just cold meat and the bitter bite of creek water. The horses were tied close, their breathing a low, steady rhythm in the dark. Elijah lay on his bedroll, listening to the quiet movements of the camp. Somewhere in the darkness, 2 men spoke in low Comanche. He couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was tight, urgent, like men making plans they didn't want heard. He closed his eyes and forced his breathing to slow. If they thought he was asleep, they might say more. But after a few minutes, the voices faded. When he opened his eyes again, he saw the stars wheeling above, cold and infinite. The thought came unbidden. Psalm 121:4, his mother's voice in memory. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. He wasn't sure if that was comfort or warning. Before dawn, Tahan roused them. "We ride hard today," he said. "Every false trail we burn is one less step for Keita to hide behind." Elijah caught the flicker in Chano's eyes at the name. It wasn't fear of the man, it was recognition. And that, more than the rumor of bluecoats, told him the real trail was getting warmer. By mid-morning, the trail funneled them toward the eastern ridges, where the Canadian River bent in a slow, muddy loop. Tahan reined in at the bank, scanning the far side. The water was still swollen from the storm, carrying broken branches and foam. One of the scouts pointed. "There, hoofprints on the far shore, fresh." Tahan's eyes narrowed. They crossed here. Elijah studied the churned mud. The prints were deep, the edges still crisp. Whoever had taken Naya had remounted, dragging her with them, and moved quickly. Something else caught his eye. A scuffed patch along a low shelf of limestone a few yards downstream. A frayed length of rope dangled from it, fibers worn and damp.
"She was tied there," Tahan said, dismounting. He crouched, fingers brushing the stone. "Held long enough for the horses to be ready." Elijah followed the chief's gaze up the slope. There, just above the rope mark, the rock face bore faint black smears, like charcoal dragged across rough stone. He climbed halfway up to get a closer look. The marks weren't random, they were strokes, deliberate, angled. A shape began to resolve, a small circle with two lines through it. He'd seen it before. "In the bark at the river," he said aloud. Tahan joined him, recognition flaring in his eyes. "Naya's hand, she leaves a sign when she can." It was subtle, tucked where only a hunter or someone searching with purpose would spot it. To Elijah, it whispered urgency without panic. She was alive when she made it. The warriors spread out, checking the approaches. The canyon mouth ahead was narrow, flanked by sheer walls. The wind funneled through it in low, moaning gusts. "This place," Elijah murmured, "you've said before, it's not one you ride into lightly." Tahan's face was unreadable. "It is a hunter's ground, if you are the one in the rocks above." Elijah felt the weight of that. From the moment he'd seen the frayed rope, the smudge of charcoal, the fresh hoofprints leading in, not out, the thought had been clawing at him. "They're waiting for us here," he said quietly. The chief didn't answer immediately. Instead, he signaled his men into a tighter formation. No splitting off, no riders straying. Bows were unstrung but close to hand. Rifles stayed in leather cases for now. To the casual eye, it might have looked like they were simply proceeding with caution. To Elijah, it felt like threading a needle while knowing there was a blade on the other side. They moved forward at a walk. The canyon walls closed in, blotting out part of the sky. The air was cooler here, heavy with the scent of damp stone. Elijah's eyes roamed the ridges above, where sunlit rock gave way to shadowed shelves, perfect spots for a rifleman to lie unseen. A flicker of movement, just a crow lifting from its perch, wings beating against the wind. Still, his heart thudded harder. He thought of Naya, somewhere ahead or above, marking her trail with whatever she could find. He thought of the men who had watched her go into the storm, and the ones who had helped her vanish. And he thought, without meaning to, of Proverbs 27:12. "The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty." By the time the canyon widened into a sunlit basin, Elijah knew, without needing Tahan to say it, that they had stepped directly into the place where Keita meant to break them. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The canyon narrowed until the walls loomed like prison gates. Every hoofbeat echoed twice, once from the ground, once from the rock above. Elijah's horse twitched beneath him. He didn't blame it.
Something in the air felt wrong, too still for the wind that had been chasing them all morning. The first arrow sliced the air like a tearing sail. Then came the rain, shafts hissing down from both ridges, chipping stone, punching into the dirt. Shouts in a language Elijah didn't know bounced from wall to wall, making it sound as if the canyon itself had found a voice. Tahan's order was sharp: "Close the line." Riders jerked their mounts inward, shields up, rifles half raised. The formation tightened into a moving knot, horses shoulder to shoulder.
In the chaos, Elijah's eyes found Kit's. The man wasn't ducking, he wasn't even reaching for cover. Instead, Kit stood in his stirrups, one arm lifted, not to shield himself, but to signal. 2 quick cuts of the hand toward the ridge. It was all Elijah needed. The pattern was there, the suspicion confirmed. Kit's had been the whisper in the grass since the first day. "Kit's!" Elijah's voice was lost in the din. But Tahan saw. The chief's rifle barked once, the shot punching Kit's back in the saddle. Not a killing strike, the bullet caught him in the shoulder, but it was enough to wrench the signal from his hand. The attackers faltered. For a heartbeat their rhythm broke, arrows landing wide, voices unsure. "Elijah, left side!" Tahan's voice cut through. Elijah swung his rifle up, catching the glint of steel high on the ridge, and fired. A figure dropped back behind cover. The canyon roared again as the enemy tried to recover. Stones rattled down the slopes. Somewhere above, a war horn gave a long, wavering call. There was no way back now. The walls, the ridges, the bodies hemming them in. This was the place Ketta had chosen to end it.
Elijah knew with cold clarity that they could only go forward, through whatever waited ahead. The knot of riders kept moving, shields catching arrows, boots locked in the stirrups. Beside him, Tahan's face was carved from stone, his voice steady in Comanche as he directed the counterfire. Elijah shifted in the saddle, scanning for any weakness in the ring above. Somewhere in this storm of noise and stone, there had to be a thread to pull, something that would unravel Ketta's grip on the fight. And when he found it, there'd be no hesitation. An arrow clattered against the rock just above Elijah's head, splintering to dust. He ducked, swung his rifle toward the ridge, and froze. There, half hidden behind a jumble of stone, a scrap of weather-darkened leather stirred in the wind. It wasn't a banner, it wasn't a trick of light. It was the hem of a dress, her dress. Naya. The name slipped out before he could stop it. The ridge was higher than it looked, the slope scattered with loose shale that slid under every step. Elijah climbed anyway, boots scraping, fingers clawing for holds. An arrow whined past his shoulder. Another struck sparks from the stone near his hand.
His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept moving. Halfway up, a voice called from below, "Tahans," but Elijah didn't catch the words. He reached the ledge and hauled himself over. She was there, bound at the wrists, gagged but standing. Her dark hair was matted from rain and dust, yet her eyes were steady, alert, not the eyes of someone broken. He tore the gag loose. She didn't waste the breath on thanks. "There's a way down," she said, her voice raw but quick. "Behind the yucca patch, narrow split in the rock, leads straight to the basin." Elijah's gaze flicked past her to the ridge beyond, where shadows shifted among the rocks, enemy positions, waiting for a signal. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes." He worked the knots at her wrists. The rope had cut deep, but she flexed her fingers with a grimace and pulled free. "How do you know the path?" "Used to hunt here with my father. They think no one remembers it." She glanced toward the basin below. "They're wrong." The wind rose, carrying the shouts and clash of steel from the fight below. The air smelled of dust and blood. Elijah felt the urgency coil tight in his chest. He looked at her. at the resolve in her face, and knew the truth. This was the thread he'd been searching for in the chaos. Show me. Naya moved first, slipping toward the cluster of yucca where the green spears of the plants hid the dark crack of the descent. Elijah followed, the noise of the canyon fight fading to a dull, distant roar. Every step down that shadowed path was a step deeper into the heart of the trap, and, if they were fast enough, a step toward turning it inside out. The split in the rock was no wider than a man's shoulders, dark as a mine shaft. The air inside was cooler, the noise of the battle above dulled to a distant, uneven thunder. Naya slipped through first, her movements quick but sure, one hand brushing the stone as if it were an old friend. Elijah followed, rifle angled down, boots crunching on the grit that had settled here over years of rain and wind. The passage twisted like a snake, narrowing and then opening into pockets of light where the rock had cracked away. Through one of these slits, Elijah glimpsed the basin below, the enemy's ground. A dozen men moved with purpose behind a wall of boulders, their backs to him.
In the center, a tall figure with a plaited leather band across his brow pointed and gestured, Keta. His voice carried, sharp and commanding, cutting through the clash of the fight above. Naya's breath brushed his ear. That's where he keeps the line steady. If he goes down, so does the fight. Elijah's pulse thudded in his temples. This was the heart of it, the spine of the ambush. But between them and that command post lay a slope of loose rock, every step a noise waiting to happen. The path veered left, dropping into a shallow gully where the rock turned to red dust. Naya crouched low, using the curve of the land to stay hidden. Elijah mirrored her, the smell of dry sage thick in his nose. Halfway down, he noticed her glancing at his rifle. Without a word, he slid it from his shoulder and held it out to her. "You know how to use it," he said. Her eyes met his, a flash of something unspoken passing between them. Trust, risk, necessity. She took the weapon, checking the chamber with the ease of someone who had learned young. Below, Keta turned, scanning the slopes. The timing would have to be perfect. One wrong step, and the rocks would give them away. They crept forward, inch by inch, the heat of the afternoon pressing in despite the shadows. Elijah's heart marked each moment, each shift of Keta's stance. Then they were in position, hidden behind the jagged edge of a low outcrop. Naya settled the rifle into the cradle of her shoulder, her breathing slow and measured. Elijah crouched beside her, eyes fixed on Keta. This was the moment the trap could be sprung the other way. Naya's cheek rested against the rifle's stock, her eyes locked on Keta. The distance wasn't far, but the shot still had to be clean. A miss would waste the one chance they had to tear the fight out from under him. Elijah knelt beside her, feeling the coiled tension in the air. Keta's voice carried up from below, barking orders in sharp bursts, each one answered by the fighters along the ridge. It was a rhythm, steady and confident, the pulse of the ambush. Break the rhythm, break the fight. A gust of wind slid along the slope, rattling the dry leaves of the yucca. Naya waited, breathing with it, letting it pass. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound ricocheting off the canyon walls. Keta staggered back with a roar, clutching his thigh. Not a killing wound, but deep enough to drop him to one knee. The effect was instant. The calls from the ridges faltered. Some men looked back in confusion, others froze altogether. Without Keta's voice, the machine ground to a halt. Elijah exhaled hard, only then realizing he'd been holding his breath. Below, Tahan seized the moment. His voice rang out, commanding and fierce, cutting through the canyon like a blade. "Forward!"
The knot of Comanche riders surged, arrows and bullets snapping into the enemy's scattered cover. The move wasn't reckless. Tahan's men stayed in formation, shields high, advancing with the measured force of a tide. Another shout rose in Elijah's mind, unspoken but clear, words his mother had taught him in darker days. He trains my hands for battle, my arms can bend a bow of bronze. Psalm 18:34. Naya worked the rifle's lever and scanned for a second shot, but the enemy was breaking. Some ducked behind rocks, others slipped away into the creases of the canyon. Keta, teeth clenched, was shouting again, but the power was gone from his voice.
His men no longer moved like a single body. They were a scattering of frightened individuals, each one suddenly aware of his own skin. Elijah touched Naya's arm. "We need to get down there before they regroup." She nodded once, and together they began their descent, sliding over loose stone, the smell of gunpowder sharp in their throats. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time since the canyon walls had closed around them, the current was running their way. By the time Elijah and Naya reached the basin floor, the fight had fractured into pockets of resistance. The canyon no longer echoed with one voice. It was a jumble of shouts, steel on stone, and the pounding of retreating boots. Tahan was already in motion, his horse driving forward like a wedge through the chaos. Two warriors flanked him, dragging a man from the saddle, Kit's. Blood darkened the shoulder of his shirt, where Tahan's bullet had found him, but his eyes were still quick, still searching for a way out. "Bind him," Tahan ordered. Kit spat into the dust, but the warriors forced him to his knees. Elijah saw the shift in his expression, the flash of calculation when he realized the fight was lost.
"It wasn't just me," Kit said, his voice hoarse. "Chano told them where you'd ride. Ravo kept the horses ready for their escape." The names landed like stones. Chano was already being dragged from cover, arms twisted behind his back. He didn't protest. Ravo tried to run, but two warriors cut him off, the sound of their boots on stone echoing like a drumbeat. Elijah glanced toward the ridges. Without Keta's command, and with the betrayal laid bare, the last of the ambushers were lowering their weapons. Some melted into the rocks, hands raised in surrender. Others simply dropped their bows and sat where they were, staring at the ground as if the dust might swallow them whole. Keta was still on his feet, leaning on one of his men, the blood from his thigh marking a trail in the dirt. His glare found Tahan, but there was no triumph in it, only the weight of a plan come apart. Tahan dismounted, stepping toward him. "You wanted to break us in front of our own. Instead, your own men will speak of this day." Keta's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The prisoners were bound with rawhide and blindfolded according to the old laws.
There would be no quick retribution here. Judgment would come before the council. Elijah recognized the wisdom in it. Killing them now would make martyrs. Letting the truth spread would make fools of them. Dust settled slowly in the basin, the last echoes of battle fading into the wind. For the first time since they'd entered the canyon, Elijah felt the press of danger ease. Not gone, but no longer tightening like a noose. The basin felt unnaturally still once the shouting stopped. The only sounds were the low murmur of warriors securing the prisoners and the restless shifting of horses. Elijah sank to one knee beside a flat rock, flexing his hand. The cut across his palm was deeper than he'd thought, earned in the scramble up the ridge. But the sting barely registered now. Naya crouched beside him, her fingers gentle as she unwrapped a strip of cloth from her own sleeve. "Hold still," she said, binding the wound with a firmness that made him obey without protest. Her face was streaked with dust, her hair tangled, but her eyes were steady. "You climbed for me," she said quietly,
not as a question. He shrugged. Seemed the only way forward. Nearby, Tahan was directing a small group to collect what the enemy had left behind: coils of rope, strips of rawhide, and, most tellingly, a flat stone streaked with charcoal marks. Elijah recognized the same angular symbols he'd found carved into the bark back at the river. "These will speak for themselves at the council," Tahan said, his voice carrying just enough for the prisoners to hear. Kit sat apart, his shoulder bound, but his gaze still darting, searching for gaps in the ring of guards. Chano and Ravo kept their heads down, the fight gone from them. The sun slid lower, throwing long shadows that turned the canyon walls to gold. Elijah felt the weight of the day pressing into his bones, but beneath it there was something steadier, an unshaken core that hadn't been there when they'd set out. He glanced toward Naya, who was reloading the rifle she'd carried down the ridge. Her movements were calm, deliberate, without a trace of hesitation. Tahan walked over, resting a hand briefly on Elijah's shoulder. "You read them well," the chief said. "You saw the traitor before I could name him." "That is why we still stand." Elijah started to answer, but the words caught. Instead, a verse rose unbidden, one his father had favored when storms broke. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer." Psalm 18:2. He didn't speak it aloud, but the truth of it sat with him, deep and solid. As the last of the evidence was packed and the horses readied for the ride home, the wind swept clean through the canyon. It smelled of dust and stone, but also of something lighter, like air after rain. The storm had passed. What came next would be judgment and, perhaps, peace. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. By the time Elijah's homestead came into view, the air carried a low hum of voices. Word of what had happened in the canyon had traveled ahead of them, carried by riders and rumor. People were waiting, settlers and Comanche alike, drawn together not by ceremony, but by the need to see justice done. The prisoners were brought forward, their hands bound with strips of rawhide. No one shouted, no one threw stones. The silence was heavier than noise, the kind of silence that tells a man his deeds have already judged him. The council of elders gathered in a half-circle on the packed earth. Their faces bore the lines of years lived hard but fair. Here the law was old and clear. Each man would answer for his own guilt, not another's. Kit's stood first, shoulders squared but eyes darting. He did not waste breath on denial. The evidence was as plain as the dust on his boots. The elders spoke in turn, each voice steady. Their decision was banishment, beyond the range of the Comanche, with the warning that if he returned, he would not leave again. Chano's role had been smaller, but no less shameful. His sentence was to work for those he had wronged, a servant under the eyes of the people he'd betrayed, until his debt was paid. Ravo, youngest and least involved, was stripped of his horses and placed under watch, his freedom earned back only with time and trust. It was justice without cruelty, firm but without the taste of vengeance. Those who had suffered loss saw that their pain was honored. Those who had erred saw that mercy had a cost. When the sentences were done, Chief Tahan stepped forward. His gaze found Elijah, and for a moment the noise of the gathered crowd faded. "This man," Tahan began, his voice even but carrying, "saw what others missed. He could have walked away, but he did not. He stood where danger was certain, and in doing so, he guarded not only one life, but the trust between our peoples." He let the words settle before adding, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." John 15:13. The verse was not preached, only spoken, like a truth too solid to need explanation. There was a murmur of assent from the crowd, both Comanche and settler. Some nodded, others simply watched Elijah with new eyes. Elijah felt the heat rise in his face. Praise was never a thing he had sought, and he didn't quite know what to do with it now. He settled for a small nod, the brim of his hat dipping in thanks. The sun hung low in the western sky, gilding the edges of the plains. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke and horses. It struck Elijah that this gathering, these two groups standing shoulder to shoulder, was rare, hard-earned, and worth keeping. Tahan spoke once more, his voice quieter now, meant for those nearest. "Trust is a bridge," he said.
"It will hold if men choose to stand on it together." Elijah didn't answer right away. He was thinking about bridges, how they took time to build, how they could be lost in a single storm, and how, sometimes, a man didn't know he was standing on one until it carried him across. When the crowd began to break apart, Elijah stayed a moment longer, watching the last light spill across the grasslands. The day had been long, hard, and full of danger. But as the people began to move toward the campfires, speaking quietly in two languages, he felt the first true ease he'd known in years. Peace wasn't a gift you kept by locking it away. It was something you guarded with open hands. The gathering had thinned, but a knot of people still stood near the council fire. The evening light had gone soft, turning the dust in the air into a golden haze. Naya stepped forward from the edge of the group. In her hands, folded with surprising care, was Elijah's old wool coat, the same coat he'd draped over her shoulders on that rain-lashed night. "I believe this belongs to you," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, something between gratitude and the quiet understanding of a shared burden. Elijah reached out, taking the coat slowly, as though it might dissolve if handled too quickly. "It kept you warm?" he asked, half smiling. "It kept me alive," Naya answered. The crowd seemed to still at that, the words carrying farther than either of them had intended. Chief Tahan's gaze moved from the coat to Elijah. "A man keeps the cold from another not only with cloth, but with a heart willing to give," he said. It was not meant as flattery. It was the kind of statement that landed deep, the way truth always does. Elijah looked down at the worn fabric in his hands. The seams were frayed, and the wool had faded, but the coat felt heavier now than when he'd first offered it. Not from wear, but from the meaning it had gathered along the way. Beyond the firelight, the Texas panhandle stretched in every direction, the horizon unbroken. Above it, the sky blazed with the last embers of sunset. He thought of how peace was like that sky, wide and beautiful, but never permanent. It needed watching. It needed people willing to keep standing, even when the wind rose. From somewhere behind him, someone called his name, inviting him to join the evening meal at the camp. The warmth in the voice left little room for refusal. He realized, with a quiet sort of surprise, that he was no longer an outsider here. As the people began to move toward the cooking fires, Elijah stayed for a moment, letting the sound of their mingled voices wash over him. Settler and Comanche, side by side. Not without scars, not without history, but walking toward the same place. A thought rose in his mind, unbidden yet welcome, like the glow from the first stars overhead. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Hebrews 13:2. He didn't need to speak it aloud. The meaning was there in the simple act of the coat's return, in the way Naya had stood before him without fear, in the way the crowd had listened without judgment. Somewhere in that quiet, he understood what the older folks in the crowd had likely known all along, that the coat had been more than warmth, that refusing to split the party had broken the ambush, that the canyon had been the only place for a trap, that Kitz's restless eyes had marked him as the traitor, that Naya's steady aim had been no accident, but the fruit of lessons sown years before.
They had read the signs before they were spoken, and they would carry the story, the way people carry truth, passed hand to hand, shaped by memory, kept alive in the telling. Elijah pulled the coat over his arm and stepped toward the firelight. The night would be cool, but the wind had softened. Somewhere ahead, the smell of mesquite and fresh bread was already drifting through the camp. He was not the man he had been at dawn. He was not alone. And tomorrow, if the peace still held, he would be there to see it through. For those who remember the old ways, the dust on the trail, the unspoken bonds, the quiet courage, this was more than a tale. It was a mirror to lives lived with grit and grace.
If stories like this stir your heart, keep riding with us for more true Wild West stories, because some legacies deserve to be kept alive.